I'm Darren Penner. I'm an immigration lawyer at Belton Law. I help people immigrate through starting new businesses, bringing existing businesses to Canada. I also do a lot of family class applications, and I help employers bring workers to Canada. I'm happy to be joined today by Kyle Kirkegaard and Chris Lennon from Empowered Startups. Empowered Startups is a designated business incubator in the Startup Visa program. Just to introduce Kyle and Chris, Kyle is the VP of Programs at Empowered Startups, where she manages the intake process for Empowered Startups and supports entrepreneurs as they begin their journey in Canada, along with Portugal and the USA. And Kyle, maybe we can get you to talk a little bit about that later. Chris is the president and general counsel of Empowered Startups. Chris has been leading Empowered Startups for over 7 years and brings with him well over a decade of experience as a technology and corporate lawyer advising startups, corporate boards, universities, and research organizations on varied aspects of intellectual property, corporate finance, and governance. Today, we're focusing on entrepreneurs and some of the ways in which you might be able to bring your business to Canada or start a new business in Canada. We have a section on the Startup Visa program, and then we'll discuss a couple of provincial nominee programs aimed at entrepreneurs before talking about work permit streams that may be of some interest. So let's get started on the Startup Visa program. At the outset, I think it's important to understand the difference between permanent residents and temporary residents in Canada. People can come two different ways. Basically, you can come over as a temporary resident, and temporary residents are workers, students, and visitors, or you can come over as a permanent resident. The goal for a lot of people coming to Canada is to be a permanent resident, but lots of times they have to start off as temporary residents. So they start off as workers, and then they go through the system and they look for a permanent residence program. And eventually, when they have enough points or they meet the other requirements, they can go ahead and apply for permanent residence. The reason I'm explaining that now is because we're starting with the Startup Visa program, and that's a permanent residence program. That means that this program has some value above other programs because you don't need to worry about coming in as a worker and then trying to figure out how you're going to get PR status. You've got that pathway right to permanent residence at the outset. So what is it? It's a program for entrepreneurs. We're looking for businesses that are innovative, that create jobs, and businesses that are able to compete globally. The innovation aspect, I think, is important, and maybe Kyle and Chris can speak to this a little bit later. But generally, from what I see, you're not going to have a Startup Visa candidate who is opening a restaurant or a dry cleaner or something like that, unless there's something incredibly innovative about that. Maybe robots are serving the food or something like that. But generally speaking, there needs to be something about the business that makes it kind of fresh and new. One interesting aspect of the Startup Visa program is that candidates have to gain support from a designated organization. IRCC has designated a number of organizations that work with candidates, and if they meet the requirements of the organization, they will issue a commitment certificate. So the types of organizations are business incubators, venture capital funds, and angel investors. So Empowered Startups, and we have Chris and Kyle here today from Empowered Startups. They're a business incubator. So they bring people through the Startup Visa program, and they issue commitment certificates. So once a commitment certificate is issued, then a candidate can apply for permanent residence. Now, this is an interesting aspect of the program because your business can have up to 5 key members. They can be designated as essential or non-essential, but 5 people can come. So basically, if you have somebody in leadership, somebody in finance, somebody in tech, basically all these people who are going to contribute to the growth of the business and its success, they can all be on the permanent residence applications. And in fact, they'll each file their own application. They can bring family members. So they can bring a spouse or a common law partner. Common law partner is defined as someone who an applicant has lived in a marriage-like relationship for at least 12 months. And then they can bring children. Under 22, definitely. And if children at 22 or over, they may be able to be included, but only if there's some reason why they've been financially dependent on the applicant since before the age of 22. So what happens is an applicant will go through the program. We'll just take business incubators, for example. They'll go through the program, the incubator will issue the commitment certificate, and then they'll also issue a letter of support at that time. We get the letter of support then from the client, if we're acting as a client, and we send out a request for a lot of other documents. IRCC, when you're submitting an application, needs a lot of information. There's a lot of forms to fill out. So we're asking for things like education history, there's police certificates, definitely passports, national IDs, birth certificates, things like that. Interestingly, at the permanent resident stage, we're not asking for a lot on the business itself because the incubator has already vetted the business and IRCC has the commitment certificate. We provide summaries and some information, and we always ask for a business plan, but that's not the focus of the permanent residence application. Now, it's important to understand that these permanent residence applications are crucial to the process. For one thing, they all have to be submitted before the commitment certificate expires. It's going to be valid for 6 months from the date of issue, and it can't be extended. So once that clock starts running, it's important to get started on those applications. And in this way, all of the team members are tied together to a certain extent. In the Startup Visa program, all essential team members have to submit an application for permanent residence while the commitment certificate is still valid. And the real kicker here is that if one team member is denied, then all are going to be denied. So it's very important that someone look at these applications and make sure they're prepared correctly. Once the applications are submitted, then we can look at work permit applications, because that's usually what people want to do. They want to come over and get started while they're waiting for the permanent residence applications to process. So one thing I wanted to mention too, with the permanent residence application, there's requirements for funds and requirements for language. Language for English needs to be a level of Canadian language benchmark 5. This is fluency, probably lower fluency, but still a person needs to be able to speak a significant amount of English or French to pass this. So this is a consideration going into the program. Another thing then is the proof of funds, and IRCC is strict on this. So the amount of funds that you need depends on the number of family members that are coming with you. So for one person, it'll be a specific amount, and then you add some on if there's a spouse or common law partner, and then more for each child. This amount also changes for the work permits, and I'll discuss that maybe a little bit more in a few minutes, but for the permanent residence applications, we need to be thinking about funds. Once the applications are submitted, then we fall into a little bit, right now is what is a processing black hole. When the Startup Visa program was introduced, I think Chris and Kyle might know this better than me, but I think it was 2013. Yep. One of the real selling features of the program was 6 months of PR processing. So you could submit your application for permanent residence, and IRCC said that it would be processed in a 6-month time period. Now, these days, that doesn't sound all that incredible, because we've had Express Entry, which started in 2015, and Express Entry, except for during COVID, has always functioned at around 6 months. But at the time, it was remarkable, because the norm for permanent residence applications was at least 2 years of processing. Often we were up to 3. Now, what happened is over the years, things changed. It's a longer processing time now. So what was 6 months? I think right now the estimated processing time is around 3 years. It's quite a bit longer. And this has been an issue because oftentimes people want to get started, and the officer processing the PR application is likely going to expect certain benchmarks to be met along the way. even though it's not a strict requirement that the business be incorporated in an operation, officers really want to see that there's some commitment. I think there's a feeling out there that there's a certain number of people who say they're going to start a business and they don't actually follow through on it. And I think IRCC is aware of that and checking a little bit more carefully than they used to. So a key component of this is having a work permit. And there's been changes to the work permits lately, but generally what it was before just a few weeks ago was you get a 1-year work permit under the Startup Visa program. So you get 1 year, you're allowed to come and work at your startup, and you have to prove funds. It's around double the funds you have to prove for the work permit than you have to prove for the permanent residence application. You have to prove these funds. You can bring family members at this point or not. We have some teams that want to bring everybody, and then we have other teams who say just the actual team members, the principal applicants themselves, are going to come. But our advice traditionally has been, get your work permits and come on over. Whenever IRCC reaches out and asks for process or progress, we want to be able to show them that there has been some. So these work permits at 1 year made a lot more sense when Startup Visa was processing quite quickly. I mean, back when there was a 6-month processing time, a 1-year work permit would get them through the entire processing. In recent years, as we've gone up to 3 years, it's made much less sense because you get a 1-year work permit, come on over, and you find that it seems like every 8 months you're getting ready to start a new application, and you're waiting so long for permanent residence. So this has finally been addressed. We had some comments from the immigration minister, I think about a year ago, May, telling us that a new work permit was coming for Startup Visa. And I personally had stopped believing it up until a few weeks ago. And then we got the announcement. So what it is now is it's a 3-year open work permit. Now, open work permit doesn't mean there's no longer going to be an expectation to advance the business, but it does give people a little more flexibility. And 3 years presumably will let you go all the way through to permanent residence, hopefully on 1 work permit. Now, one wrinkle we're running into with this is IRCC has set out a requirement that the permanent residence application receive an acknowledgement of receipt before the application for a work permit is submitted. We are very much up in the air about what this really means, and we need some more direction from IRCC on it. My feeling right now is that it may still be possible without it, but that's going to have to be something that we wait and see on. The AOR, the Acknowledgement of Receipt, we shorten that to AOR, can often take 18, 24 months to be issued. I think right now we have applications that have been processing for well over a year, and there's no sign of the AOR yet. So if the AOR really is a requirement for the work permit, it kind of frustrates the intent of the program, because IRCC wants these work permits submitted within 6 months, and that can't be done if it's going to take them 18 months to issue the AOR. Now, I will say in the previous work permit manual that IRCC had published for Startup Visa work permits, it was stated that an AOR could be submitted or other proof of submission, basically the email confirmation issued through the PR portal and proof of payment of the processing fees could be substituted for the AOR. And we do this in other programs sometimes that require AORs. So my feeling is that we can probably get around it, but we don't have any confirmation on that yet. Chris or Kyle, did you want to maybe jump in at this point and give us some perspective from Business Incubator on the Startup Visa program?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Darren. Happy to do that. So as Darren said, both Kyle and I are from Empowered Startups. We've been involved with in the Startup Visa program since 2014, and as Darren referenced, the program did start in 2013. When it was first launched, however, business incubators weren't incorporated at all. It was the only designated entities were a small number of designated angel groups and a few designated venture capital organizations. And essentially what happened was after the first roughly year of the program, there was virtually no applications. I think the number was 6 or something like that, like super, super small. So IRCC realized, as they often do when they launch new programs and pilot programs, this was launched as a 5-year pilot program at the time, which is quite common with business immigration programs. But as is often the case, they eventually realize that they don't get it quite right initially, and they have to make some changes. Similar thing has happened in the Alberta program, which we might get an opportunity to introduce a little bit later. So in addition to a few other changes they made, like removing at the time requirements for university degrees and some other things that were layered on, the big change that they made is they decided they were going to bring in designated business incubators as entities that could issue commitment certificates. And the main reason for this was they kind of realized that it's very unlikely that an angel group or a venture capital fund are going to make an at-risk investment in a business that can't be started, or could potentially be started but can't continue, except for by the grace and at the mercy of the bureaucratic process of IRCC. It's just, that's completely outside the control of what the investors can manage. So not surprisingly, there really weren't many commitments issued at all. And so they added the possibility for business incubators to come in. The idea was the same as angels and venture capital funds, although we carry it out a little bit differently. But essentially, the responsibility of designated business incubators, and really all designated entities, are twofold. We're supposed to be going out and seeking and finding the best and the brightest, those most likely to come to Canada and start businesses with the potential to scale and generate valuable economic activity and drive innovation in Canada. And we're also there to heavily vet both the proposed business, but also the individuals. And I would say the vetting is even more heavily weighted on the individuals, because IRCC has always recognized that by the very nature of the types of businesses that they want in the startup visa program, they're startups, they're growth-oriented business. You don't have to look too far to realize that the stats on growth-oriented businesses are that an overwhelming majority of them fail. So IRCC's from the get-go always acknowledged that there's it would be counterintuitive or counterproductive, I should say, to put business performance requirements on the business, and that's another one of the key benefits of the program. But although there's no requirement for the business to succeed, intention is absolutely critical. And that's kind of where we come in, is we're supposed to be vetting the credentials, the leadership capability, and also the genuine intentions of the founders, because IRCC is perfectly fine with a startup team that comes in under the startup visa program and their business fails, provided that they're the type of people that if they have one failure, they're just going to start something else. So long term, you're going to have some successes. What they don't want are people that don't really make a genuine intention of ever really starting the business, or just kind of go through the motions. So critical piece of our role in the program, as with all incubators, is to heavily vet the intentions. And we have some of our own ways of doing that. One of which comes back to Darren's point about the use of the work permit. We have always required that anyone we accept into our program, any team that we accept into our program, will launch the business before they get their permanent residence. And as Darren suggested, I think that's becoming increasingly expected. But initially it wasn't. You could just have a proposed plan and start the business after you get permanent residence. But as processing times got longer and longer, it doesn't make sense to have a proposed startup that you're going to wait 4 years to start. Because if you really had an innovative idea, well, it's unlikely to be innovative 4 years from now. So, and I think everybody realizes that. we always took the position that anybody who genuinely wanted to start a business and get going in Canada should really be keen on getting going right away. So we've always required that they launch the business with us while the permanent residences application is being processed.
Mhm.
I think that probably takes care of the background and perspective of what we do.
Yeah, I think so. And the only other thing to add is really around what the experience is like when you're actually working with a designated incubator. So if you are admitted, it's more than just really that commitment certificate and letter of support, which is the gateway, you could say, to your permanent residency. But it's about finding that designated incubator that can help you, as Chris and Darren have mentioned, with launching your business remotely, because that's essential for your immigration success, essential for progressing your business. And so, for example, at Empowered, everything is delivered remotely. You have fantastic mentors who are behind you to help you, and we really help to network and connect and train you overall within the Canadian startup ecosystem to help you achieve that success. So, yeah.
Thank you. And it's interesting, what you say about vetting, because I think people going in need to realize that there's serious vetting going on, right? I mean, it's not just a process where you go through, it's a process where you have to show that you meet certain requirements.
Absolutely. And so in our intake process, for example, to begin, it's always starting with going through CVs, resumes. We have interviews within the process. So not only do we get to know the applicants, they also get a chance to know us as well. And then making sure, of course, that the business meets the requirements around innovation, creating jobs, having that ability to scale and compete globally are really critical. Something at Empowered that we understand is how to work with startups in any stage. So when we're looking at our intake process, we do work with startups that are just in the idea stage. It's not as if they have to be positive revenue generating. And then we're also industry agnostic. So we work across all industries as well within that intake process.
No, that's great. And in a way, it's made our job easier as lawyers, because often we're proving the case to IRCC when we're submitting an application, especially for businesses and entrepreneurs. But with Startup Visa, we know that the designated organization issuing that commitment certificate gets them most of the way there, right? So we have to make sure that all the right boxes are checked. I think maybe the one difference now, which has come in, I think these were not the most recent work permit changes, but the ones that happened, I think about a year and a half ago, where they added the wording that the work permit there must be a significant economic benefit to Canada. That was an interesting change because it's really caused us to focus more on the business in the work permit stage, and more than we focus on it at the PR stage. So we're proving to an officer that there is a real business need for this person to come over right now. But now that officers at the work permit stage are assessing these applications on the significant benefit criteria, it can lead to some interesting results. I mean, we can have situations where a team is approved for PR, but not for the work permit, because they don't feel that the position requires someone to come over for a work permit. So I think a few of these things need to be sorted out a little bit more, but right now that's where we're at.
And that was part of the initial intention. When the program was launched, it was to really move the evaluation of the business and the business related credentials of the individual from the IRCC officers, and place it on designated entities who are supposed to be better versed in assessing the potential capability of a startup and their founders. IRCC still at times wades in and asks questions related to the business, but that's really I think a way of double checking and vetting intention, right? Like it's like when you go to the border and you're asked the same question 3 times in 3 different ways. Or they got to make sure the story adds up. But that was kind of the context in the start.
And it's interesting that they do that for the permanent residence application, while now letting the officers wade in much more at the work permit stage. It's an interesting situation.
You would know much more about that, but our answer to significant benefit has always been, the venture has to be started in Canada with the intention of
Mhm.
having the mind and management in Canada and all the growth related to the business in Canada. Of course, you can be selling internationally. I mean, I don't think any growth-oriented business wouldn't be in Canada wouldn't be looking to external markets for sales channels. But they don't want, and they've never wanted, businesses that just kind of set up in Canada, but have all their employment and operations offshore. I mean, there's very little benefit to Canada for doing that, right? It's just getting someone an immigration pathway.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was going to ask you, maybe we'll leave it to the end section, but it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on just the most recent changes and what you think might be in store. Maybe reading the tea leaves or something like that. But maybe we'll leave that to the last section. Right now, let's move into provincial nominee programs. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I want people to know that they exist. So what a provincial nominee program is it's a way for a province to nominate someone who they think should be a permanent resident of Canada. Now, in Canada, immigration is federal. It's administered by the federal government, and traditionally the provinces did not have much say in who is going to become a permanent resident. Plus, when someone does become a permanent resident, they have a right to live in every province. So it left the provinces without a lot of decision-making power. Some years ago, the provinces got together and made an agreement with the federal government. That was a little more piecemeal than that, but that's where we've ended up. And these provincial nominee programs were born. There's two main types. You can come through as an individual by scoring points, work experience, getting an offer from an employer, and meeting quite a few requirements that way. But they also have entrepreneur streams. Now, traditionally, the entrepreneur streams have been used a lot less. You get programs like Startup Visa, which are much more popular than the PNP streams, and I'll explain why in a minute. There are varying versions of these entrepreneur streams all across the country, and today we can't get into all of them. But what we thought we would do is I would talk about the BC streams a little bit, and then Chris would jump in and talk about the Alberta program. So in BC, there are a couple different streams that might be of interest to entrepreneurs. The way the program works basically is they have a base stream, and then they also have a regional stream. The base stream applies province-wide. If you want to come in and start a new business in BC, or invest in take over an existing business, then you may be eligible. It doesn't matter where the business is located, and it doesn't matter what the size is, with a few caveats that I'll get into. The other stream then is the regional stream. The regional is interesting because it requires less investment, and it requires less of a personal net worth, but it's limited in terms of what businesses you could actually buy. Various communities in BC have signed up to be part of this stream, and then they say what types of businesses they want generally. So you go through and you look at these communities, and you can have a look at what they want. So let me just have a quick look here. Just to give you an example. So one of the communities participating is Clinton. This is in our Okanagan region. Clinton, you can start a business there under the regional stream if you are looking to open a business in the sporting goods sector, pharmacies, and full service restaurants. There's usually three or four sectors that they will list. So it's worth looking at. I don't find that a lot of people don't go through these streams, but the possibility is there. In terms of how it works, let's go back to what we discussed about permanent residents versus temporary residents, and why the Startup Visa program is so good, because you come in with that guaranteed pathway to permanent residence. Once you've got your commitment certificate, as long as you jump through all the right hoops and do everything you said you were going to do, you should become a permanent resident. Provincial nominee programs work a little bit differently. what you need to do is you have your business proposal, and I'm going to leave out some steps here. I'm not going to go into all the details, but this is more of a higher level look. You have your business proposal, and you basically register in the PNP pool. You're assigned points for various categories, but if they like your proposal, basically they'll usually invite you for an interview. What you do is you get assessed, and there's a process there. If you're approved, you don't get permanent residence. What you get is a work permit. So you take your work permit and you sign something called a performance agreement. The performance agreement says various things that you need to do. You get your work permit, you come to BC, you start your business, and then you start fulfilling your performance agreement. It can take anywhere between 18 and 24 months, usually. I think extensions might be available in some cases, but you should count on it around 18 to 24 months. Once the terms of the performance agreement have been fulfilled, at that time, the PNP program will issue you with a nomination, and then you can use your nomination to apply for permanent residence. So there are a few issues that make the program less attractive. The base stream requires an investment of $200,000, which, I mean, if you're starting a business, this is not an incredible amount of money, but it's a significant amount of money. You have to have a personal net worth of $600,000. In the regional stream, it's lower. The investment needs to be $100,000, and your personal net worth needs to be $300,000. You have to have language ability of Canadian language benchmark 4. And then there needs to be some sort of combination of either management experience or post-secondary education that makes sense for the business that you're going to purchase. Now, part of this, and I think Chris might speak to this when he talks about the Alberta program, because I think they've made some headway there. The part of the problem is the performance agreement, because you come in, you invest a lot of money, you sign a performance agreement, and you don't really know if everything is going to work out. If for some reason you can't meet the requirements of the performance agreement, you could find yourself on the other end without a nomination, right? So then you've come to Canada, you've started a business, and you haven't really gotten anywhere, because remember, until you get that nomination, you're a temporary resident. You have a work permit. That work permit has an expiry date. And once it expires, you either need to figure out a way to stay, or you need to be able to apply for permanent residence somehow. And I think in my history with clients, that's where the rub is. That's what makes them nervous, just because it's a lot to invest, and they don't really have any assurance that the whole process is going to work. Contrast that with something like the Startup Visa program, where by the time that commitment certificate is issued, you've got your pathway. Your pathway is set. You hope you can get the work permit, and really you should be able to get it. But even if you don't, you know that pathway is set to permanent residence. I don't have the numbers in terms of how many people they invite, but it's not a lot. We don't have a lot of people going through the entrepreneurial programs, and we may see some changes in coming years to make it more attractive to people, especially if Alberta is making changes, then BC may want to catch up at some point. But right now, this is something I file under possible, but probably not a first choice. Definitely, though, happy to discuss it further with anyone who might be interested in it. It is a good way sometimes to buy a smaller business in BC. If a business is getting ready to close, the BC PNP may give you some extra credit for that, for keeping a business going and keeping employees employed. And there's a lot we could discuss about it. I'm gonna, in the interest of time, I think I'll leave it there. But Chris, did you want to say something about the Alberta program?
Sure, yeah, because Alberta is the only provincial program we deal with, and the reason really is because it is most, at least in my opinion, most similar to the Startup Visa program. There still are some distinctions. But the Alberta program was also created by the province when the same Minister of Immigration who was behind the Startup Visa program was the Premier of Alberta. And when Alberta was looking to create this stream of their entrepreneurial program, they actually brought us in early, and so we were involved in consultations when they were building the program, and I think that's why structurally it's quite similar to the startup visa program, and the commitment from them, or the intention, was that although there is still the business performance agreement, what they committed to was that everything that has to be completed in the business performance agreement would always be purely an objective evaluation. And so our role, I'll let Kyle speak to the requirements of the program if we have a few minutes, but our role again is like in the startup visa program, to vet the entrepreneur, in this case it's only an individual, and the proposed business. And then with that, you actually end up with a business plan that needs to be executed over the first 12 to 18 months. And Alberta's intention is that all of the commitments you make in that business plan, and then that gets filtered into the business performance agreement, are things that are fully within the entrepreneur's control. So you're not going to commit to, I don't know, raising 3 rounds of equity of unknown amounts, because you might not be able to do that. But you can commit to investing X dollars into the business and doing a certain level of research and development and opening an office and all these things that are fully within the control of the entrepreneur. And then the idea is they should have no excuse for not doing that because it's fully within their control. But conversely, no reason for Alberta not to issue the nominee certificate if they've actually carried out what they say they're going to do. So the intention was to remove this idea that you might bring in 50 businesses, start them, and then let the province pick which 12 they want to allow to become permanent residents. Alberta's idea was, no, we're going to pick everyone that we think is worthwhile, and if they do what they set out to do, we're going to grant them all permanent residence. And so I guess my final comment on that is, and this might be a little bit going towards reading the tea leaves, but as the federal program gets increasingly restricted, I think more people will be shifting to the Alberta program and potentially other provincial programs as well in the entrepreneurial streams.
Yeah, and to add to that, that's something we've been seeing. So there's definitely growing interest as people are observing the changes around SUV and just in general around immigration here in Canada. So this Alberta program is a great option. In terms of the requirements, just some of the key differences between SUV, one is around the businesses. So more traditional businesses are actually a fit for this program. Instead, they need to be within 8 given sectors. So it can be either in technology, for example, financial services, tourism. If you're interested, I can share those at another time, or you can find them on the website as well. But it's often of interest because there's not the same pressure to find something that's innovative and new and is scalable. And then the other key difference in terms of requirements is around graduation dates. So you do need to have a degree from a university outside of Canada within the last 10 years. So that's something to be aware of. And then the third key requirement is around the investment into your business. So if you're going to be in a city center like Edmonton and Calgary, you need to invest $100,000 directly into your business. However, if you choose to go to a regional area, it's only $50,000 Canadian. So there's flexibility around that, and we're able to support you wherever you choose to go in the province, whether it's regional or at one of those city centers as well. So those are kind of the 3 key differences, I would say, between the startup visa in terms of those eligibility from our perspective as well.
It sounds like a nice. It sounds like a promising program. I mean, it's nice to have an alternative from startup visa, and it sounds like something that could fit for certain people who can't go into the startup visa program for whatever reason.
Exactly. And actually, sorry, one more fourth key difference is really around teams. So this is for sole entrepreneurs, one
right.
founder. It does not permit teams. So if you are someone who doesn't want to team up with anyone, and that's, a risk that you're not comfortable with, this is a great option as well, because it only permits sole founders with their dependent family members, of course.
Yeah, makes sense.
And it's a pretty young program too. It's I think we started working with them in 2019, but I don't believe the program was launched until 2021. And similar to the Startup Visa program, I referenced how they initially launched and didn't get it quite right. Well, that definitely happened in Alberta too, because initially the requirement was that you had to have graduated from a university outside of Canada within the last 2 years.
Right.
And that kind of came as a surprise. But after the first year, then they realized, okay, that just didn't work because it's so hard to have the ability to have the funds and the investment and start a business when you've only graduated 2 years ago. It just cut the pool down to so small that they increased it to 10 years. And the reason why I say it's still a young program is it's quite possible there'll be further little tweaks to the program to make it a little bit more advantageous or adaptable to the types of people that Alberta wants, who accept, for the fact that they don't require innovative businesses, it's pretty much an overlap in the types of entrepreneurs that they're trying to attract to Alberta, as with what the Startup Visa program set out to achieve back in 2013, 2014, and the types of entrepreneurs they're trying to attract to Canada.
Sorry if I missed this, but do you have any idea about the numbers, how successful the program is?
In Alberta, so I know the numbers have been quite small. I'd have to check ours. I think we've brought somewhere between, definitely more than 10, less than 20, somewhere in that range, I think, to Alberta.
It's 10 to 15. I haven't looked at the most recent ones either.
Yeah.
It's right in that range. Yeah.
And Alberta would like it to be more. It's not going to be a 500 venture per year team, but I'm pretty sure they would be looking for 20 to 50 a year for sure.
Yeah. Well, and as you mentioned before, look how Startup Visa started out, right? It was pretty small for the first year.
Absolutely. And in Alberta, we're one of they call it designated agency, not designated entity, but very similar. We're one of only 3. When it launched, there was only 2 of us, and they have since added a 3rd, I believe, very recently. But there's far fewer organizations doing the vetting and what's not called nomination. I guess expression of interest, I think, is what we technically have to sign off on.
Yeah.
So
Empowered is a good place to contact if someone's interested in that program then.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a couple others, but please reach out to Kyle. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Well, we have about 15 minutes left, and I did want to talk about work permits a bit, and then maybe just get a sense of where all this is going, and then see if there's any questions at the end. Now, with work permits, this again is going back to the beginning where we were talking about the difference between permanent residents and temporary residents. If you can get in a program that ends in permanent residence or starts with permanent residence, that's a great way to go, because then you've got your whole pathway figured out. If not, if you have a business, you want to get it over to Canada, but there's no other program that fits, then you may be able to get a work permit. If you get a work permit, it's going to be limited in time, and it's not necessarily going to get you to permanent residence. One thing we do when we have clients on work permits is we start a PR plan for them. So we're planning for the future and kind of guiding them on how to get there, but this doesn't have the guaranteed PR at the end. So there are a number of work permits that people use to come into the country, but the ones I wanted to talk to you about today are the intercompany transferees and the LMIA-based work permits. So these have both been very widely used over the years. Intercompany transferee is an interesting one because in its essence, it allows somebody who's been working for a foreign enterprise for at least 1 year to come over to Canada, be transferred to Canada, basically, for the purpose of working in a Canadian enterprise. Now, the 2 enterprises need to be affiliated somehow. either through parent-child, common shareholders, or so some sort of affiliation. Now, it's worked out well. It doesn't need to be a business in Canada that's already operating. One of the major uses of this program is to send somebody over in a senior management capacity for the purpose of starting the business in Canada. And that's something we've done quite often. The rules have typically been you need to work in the foreign corporation for at least a year. Both the foreign corporation and the Canadian corporation have to continue operating. They can't stop operating the foreign corporation as soon as the worker gets to Canada. And it is time limited. People can come over as managers or senior managers or in specialized knowledge roles. If there's specialized knowledge, I think it caps out at 5 years. Your initial work permit won't be for 5 years, but you can extend it up to 5. For management and senior management, it caps out at 7 years. If you're coming over to start a business in Canada for the first time, that first work permit will be 1 year because IRCC wants to see what has actually been done and then decide if they're going to issue you with a new one. After that, you can get extensions of usually 2 or 3 years. Now let me just see here. So with intercompany transferees, our issue right now is that there's just been an incredible amount of changes to the program just in the last 2 weeks. Everything seems to be different, and there are some points that everyone is not even in agreement on. At some point, IRCC is going to come through and do a very robust update to their manuals, and at that point, we'll probably know what exactly they're looking for. But right now, we're kind of synthesizing these new changes that are coming in and figuring out how it's going to affect everyone. There are 2 types. How's my time doing here? Okay, there's 2 types basically. There are intercompany transferee work permits under the general provisions, and then there's intercompany transferee work permits under a free trade agreement. So if you think of CUSMA, which we used to call NAFTA, that has a section for intercompany transferees. Their rules are slightly different than the rules under the general agreements. One major change that I don't think applies to the free trade agreements, but applies to the general rules, is that you must be now in a multinational corporation. And this is significant because up until now, someone has been able to have a business in, say, Argentina, and the size of the business doesn't really matter. It just needs to be an operating business. They want to open a branch in Vancouver. They can come up and do that directly. There doesn't need to be any other businesses anywhere else. Now it has to be multinational. So in addition to Argentina, there needs to be one other country. And then at that point, they can establish a presence in Canada. So that's been a pretty serious one that affects the general category. Some other changes to note, work location, I believe it all has to be physical premises now. They've brought this significant benefit to Canada wording into this one too. This is new. So now it's not just the transfer we're worried about. We're worried about convincing the officer that the transfer will have a significant economic benefit to Canada, which means there's going to be more vetting by IRCC, and we have to be a lot more careful to include documents that are going to impress the officer. They're going to be more careful on wages. In the past, the wage hasn't really mattered as long as people are being paid above the minimum wage for the province they're in. It's been a bit of a free-for-all that way. Apparently now they're looking a lot more at the prevailing wage and insisting that people are paid those wages. So in a nutshell, ICT work permits look a lot different than they did a few months ago, and we're still getting used to all the changes. But for the right applicants, it's still a good way to come in. You can come in and get a work permit, establish your business in Canada, and then we can continue planning your pathway to permanent residence. The last one I will talk about quickly is LMIA-based work permits. An LMIA is a labor market impact assessment. Usually, when an employer wants to bring an employee to Canada, it's a 2-step process. In the first step, the employer applies to Service Canada for the LMIA. Once the LMIA is approved, then the worker can take that and use it to apply for a work permit. Now, the LMIA is the employer's application. When we prepare these, we only need the name and date of birth of the employee and where they live. Everything else is completely employer focused. They want to make sure the employer can afford to pay the employee. They want to make sure that the employer is operating a good in Canada, which means offering goods or services for sale. And that has teeth to it. We have to send in documents, business licenses, things like that, proving that the employer really is operating a legitimate business. Once we do that, then a work permit is possible. Now, LMIAs used to have it wasn't really a category, it was more like an advertising exemption, but they used to have a special place for owner-operators. And this was really handy because LMIAs usually require that you advertise the position for 4 weeks before you apply for the LMIA. But for owner-operators, they didn't have to advertise because it was thought to be a bit silly that you have to advertise for your own position. If it's your business, nobody can come in and just, do what you do in your business. They also went really easy on people when it came to the business being in operation. We used to do quite a few where somebody was just about to start the business in Canada, and we were able to get the LMIA, no advertising required. LMIA is issued, they get the work permit, and they're here. It's changed quite a bit now. It's not impossible, but there are some extra steps. So now if we're doing an LMIA for an entrepreneur, we still need to do the advertisement. So we need to create an advertisement that fits the entrepreneur, fits the position, and as much as we can, make it successful for the entrepreneur. It has to be advertised for 4 weeks. Once that 4 weeks is up, we can submit the application for the LMIA. Now, the other piece to that, though, is the business does have to be running. And this can cause a problem for, say you're overseas and you want to start a business in Canada, and we're discussing ways that you can come in and do that. It's a bit of a non-starter for people. If I tell you, like, yes, you can come in through the LMIA, you just need to hire a Canadian, start your business over here without never coming into the country, make your application, and hope they'll give you a work permit to work at it. It can be, unless someone has a very specific reason for needing to be in Canada, people often don't go down that path. But it is possible, especially if people are really sure of their business idea. Maybe they don't have a lot of money to invest, and for whatever reason, they really want to be in Canada. One thing with the LMIA program, as stringent as they are on making sure that it's a legitimate business that's operating, there's no minimum investment requirements. So people can come over with a very little amount of money, and as long as they're satisfying the requirements, then they may be successful. Now, again, this is not going to get anyone to permanent residence, right? It may be helpful if they can start gathering points towards permanent residence. But these ICT work permits and LMIA work permits are just one part of the plan that you will need to become a permanent resident. And I think that's all I'm going to say about work permits, because we are getting closer to our time limit now. We did want to have some time for questions at the end, and I think we would ask for questions at 1 o'clock. And in these last 5 minutes, though, I thought it might be nice to just maybe read the tea leaves a little bit and discuss where we think these programs could go in future years. I know from an immigration perspective, there has just been a whirlwind of change over the last 5 or 6 months. I think beginning with Mexican citizens requiring visas in February, and then the changes to the Startup Visa program in April, not to mention the changes to students. It's been quite a year. And I feel like we will probably keep seeing changes like this, as headlines come out. We're probably in a government that is in its last stages, right? I mean, the election is scheduled for next year, and it may come up before that if there's a vote of non-confidence. So just from the past, what I've noticed is when governments are in these types of positions, they are very reactionary to headlines. And if a lot of headlines come out that in public opinion might not be favorable, they tend to make changes quickly. So in the last year before an election, we're used to seeing a lot of changes in immigration. I think I'm kind of stealing Chris's line here, but if a door is open, I say go through it, because if there's a program open right now, we don't know if it's going to be open next week, next month, anything like that. If you're eligible now and you can go through a program, then I would say do it. Chris, Kyle, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak specifically to Startup Visa and Alberta, but I completely agree with that sentiment. It's becoming increasingly hard to get to Canada. As you mentioned, I think the focus and the more significant restrictions as of late have been on students and temporary workers. But in April, the Startup Visa program, they launched a quota system, which is an explicit way to restrict the number of applications. And I think I mentioned, when the program was launched initially, the problem they had was nobody was applying, and over a number of years, they made some tweaks to the program to make it more attractive. And I think everyone agrees that it's a good program. But in recent years, they just lost track of intake, and that's led to the processing backlog. So they clearly are looking to restrict not only all forms of immigration to Canada, but also business streams. And Startup Visa falls in that category, and that's why we have these quota numbers allocated right now for 2024 and 2025. I think they're going to go pretty quick. My estimate is that the quota spots for Startup Visa for 2025 will probably be fully allocated by late March or April of 2025, which would mean that the Startup Visa program is going to be effectively stalled, I would think, until they clarify what quotas in place for 2026 or what's going on. And I would say I'm very confident that it's not going to be open the doors back up. I think I'm pretty confident the Startup Visa program is not going to disappear entirely, because there seems to be a recognition that it's at its core a good program. But I think we're going to see more restrictions rather than less restrictions over the coming years. So yeah, as you said, if you qualify now, well, number one, get in, because spaces might be full before halfway through 2025. But also, when spaces open up again, there might be further restrictions layered on top of what's required to even get into the stream, because they, otherwise don't, other than the quota right now, they don't have any other way of vetting numbers. But they could add something else, like, I don't know, a certain level of investment, or you have to employ a certain number of people, or who knows what it is. But I think other layered requirements will come before there are requirements removed.
Yeah, and we're seeing that as well when the quota was announced for SUV, that a designated entity could only support 10 businesses a year. That's where we saw more interest as well in the Alberta program, because it's comparable. So people are already starting to try to make those changes. And I think they're really smart to do so, because once you're in as well, you're exempt from the changes, even if you don't have your PR, right? You still are in that pathway. You're grandfathered in under the old rules. And so it's a really great opportunity if you can secure a place in something like SUV or FGES or the other programs available. It's really the time is now.
Absolutely. And if we get a new governments like to put their own spin on programs, right? So we don't know what'll be coming that way. Plus, public opinion isn't that favorable on immigration right now, and that influences policy. So it really is a time where I think in immigration we never really know what's coming, but I think especially right now there's a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, agreed.
All right, well, time for questions. If anybody has any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. It's also okay if nobody has any questions.
Can I ask one, Darren, just because Kyle touched on it, but it occurred to me that maybe it wasn't made clear, but under the Startup Visa program, and I assume other programs too, the rules that apply to the application are the rules in place at the time of the PR application being made. Is that a correct way to state it?
Yeah.
Right.
That's what we would expect. Yeah. Generally speaking, once your application is in for processing, anything that changes after would apply to anything after a date. When they're coming out with new policies, they'll usually have a firm date, and they'll say application submitted after this time, these rules apply, and then the other way.
Right. Which speaks to the jump through the door while it's open kind of statement that you made earlier. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah, so this whole uncertainty about AORs that we have right now with the new startup visa work permits, we have plenty of applications processing under the 1 year, but we didn't have that statement about AORs then. So we wouldn't worry that that would affect those applications that are already in processing. It'll be nice if, you know, with these restrictions on the number of applications that are coming in, if they can actually cut down on the processing times significantly. Hopefully that's one of the goals, and hopefully we'll see that.
Yeah, that would be a huge benefit.
For sure.
It's definitely one of the stated goals. We do have regular discussions with, you know, the policy people at IRCC, and that's definitely one of the stated reasons for the quota. And so I do think over time we will probably see processing times come down, but potentially, and you could speak more to this, delays in receiving work permits. So it's quite possible that you will be getting your PR application reviewed and potentially processed before you've received, or shortly after you've had a work permit processed. So I do think it will become increasingly important to launch your business from abroad and get going while everything's going through the processing stage. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's my advice to clients too, coming through this program. Do everything you can. Don't wait for the work permit to be issued, because at some point we will get an officer probably asking for a business update.
Right.
And I mean, I think if you're saying, well, IRCC didn't approve our work permit because it wasn't significant benefit, it gets you somewhere, but it doesn't get you far enough. You need to say, but this is what we've done to move the business forward. So that's essential. Well, okay, I guess we don't have questions, so we can wrap it up from here. As I said, this has been recorded, and we will send it out to everyone who registered. We may post it on the social media as well. So thank you again for attending, and hope everybody has a great afternoon.
Thanks, Darren.
Thanks, Darren.
Thanks a lot.
Care.
Yeah, special thanks to Chris and Kyle. We really appreciated you being here today.
No, not a problem at all. Our pleasure.
Pleasure.
All right,
Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.